Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to explore the nature of Gimel. Gimel is a term developed by my guest, Dr. Vernon Neppe, in cooperation with his partner in villainy, one might say Dr. Edward Close. Drs. Neppe and Close are the co-authors of a book called Reality Begins with Consciousness, which is an exposition of a very detailed theory about consciousness and reality. We could call it a theory of everything. And we'll be discussing that because Gimel is really central to this theory. Welcome again, Vernon.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
I should mention that your work has already achieved the distinction of having received the Whiting Memorial Prize for Innovation in Scientific Theory.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So in our previous interview, we talked about the title of which is What's the Matter with Matter. We're talking about when we look carefully at the volumetric equations for atoms and molecules and subatomic particles, something was missing, and we added that in. It was we could call it a process that has volume, but no mass and no energy, and you've given that the name of Gimel.
Yes, that is true. So we're dealing with something that is massless, without mass, and energyless, but is a third substance, a third process, a third component. Mm-hmm. And we've called it Gimel, mm-hmm. which turns out to be an apposite name because Gimel, in one kind of way of translating, it could mean camel, in terms of root, but it also really means union, bridge, going across.
We're talking about the third letter of the Hebrew alphabet.
Exactly that. Yeah. And if we look at it in this way, the first thing we ought to know about Gimel is we're talking union. Mm-hmm. In other words, you cannot talk about mass and energy without talking about this third process. Mm-hmm. It's in union. And you cannot talk about space and time without talking about this third process. It's in union or tethered together. Mm-hmm. This is very, very important because it relates to a fundamental rethink about our whole nature of reality. Mm-hmm. And this is not just a guess. This is a mathematical and scientific fact. So once we think about this, particular figures, particular mathematics, particular science, it's not a case of saying, well, you know, they've done speculations just as the string theorists have speculated on their number of dimensions and foldings and curlings. Mm-hmm. This is nothing speculative. This is scientific, empirical fact that we can prove mathematically. And Gimel is the necessary component.
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose it's fair to say that every mathematical proof starts with certain assumptions.
True.
So in this case, there will be no doubt philosophers and critics who will start looking at those assumptions that you've made.
Yeah. And so let me just run through very quickly mm-hmm. those assumptions. Mm-hmm. People would talk about space-time, and that involves extent, and we actually can measure that in dimensions. Mm-hmm. And they would talk about mass and energy, and as we know, there's an equivalence in terms of mass and energy. And those are the four basic assumptions of our conventional model of mm-hmm. physics. Mm-hmm. Now we're throwing in, on the extent side, on the measurable side, on the dimensional side, Gimel, which some would postulate is consciousness, mm-hmm. but we cannot absolutely prove it is consciousness.
On the other hand, that's the great mystery of science. How does consciousness fit in?
Of course. and the likelihood is this is a consciousness, or this is at least part of the consciousness, or Gimel is in part consciousness.
It's an important key, because what you have established is that from your perspective, matter cannot exist without this entity, this mathematical entity you're calling Gimel.
Okay. And the second component of that mathematical entity is there's also a container, a receptacle, and we talk about mass and energy. You cannot measure without having contents to measure.
Right.
It's not an emptiness. But with that mass and energy, again comes Gimel. And just very, very briefly, I'm going to mention to you something that we are busy writing about at this point in time, but which is extraordinarily important.
Okay.
I said it cannot be speculated. I said that this looks like definitive mathematical proof, but one would want to be empirical about it. One would have to say, how does this link up with our world? How do we know it links up with our world? Well, you, of course, are familiar with the great work that has been done in Switzerland, particularly in relation to the Large Hadron Collider, the LHC, which is the most sophisticated kind of instrument to measure all these subatomic particles, some of which last just a billionth of a second.
I know, they're so unstable.
It's completely unstable.
Yeah.
So you have to look at what provides stability. And what provides stability is this idea of Gimel. So let me just illustrate this.
Okay.
When you use the Large Hadron Collider, you can actually do measures. And some of these are difficult ones. For example, the so-called Higgs boson, what people were calling the God particle, even though it's not a God particle. Some are now starting to talk about Gimel being the God particle, but at least it's a stable, symmetric God particle, and it might be better called the God matrix, the GM of the Gimel with the God matrix. But be that as it may, when you start looking at these things, you start doing all sorts of calculations. And when you calculate out things like the proton, and you find it's 1836 units using a particular kind of normalizing where the electron is 1, and the neutron, ultimately it's far, far more, but it so decays, it's just a little bit more than the proton at 1839. You now have a basis there. Now, if we could apply this basis and take a totally different kind of calculation and look at it in terms of our units, which are called true units, which are triadic rotational units of equivalence. Those true units are volumetric mass energy figures, which include mass, energy, and Gimel, and you do complex calculations, and you again normalize the electron to 1. Amazingly, what do you discover? That the proton is at 1836 and the neutron is at 1839. So this is amazing, because suddenly we've spoken about how so-called atomic materialism is refuted because there had to be something else, and that something else, what was wrong with matter, was the fact that you needed Gimel. And when you start doing all these calculations using a totally different component, you develop exactly the same figures. So yes, one can get people disputing and saying, well, maybe this is all wrong. But the basis here of protons, neutrons, electrons, and the quarks, the up and down quarks, and incidentally there's 6 kinds of quarks, but the rest of them are part of this whole particle soup. They're all unstable. But when you start doing all of this, you know there's something extra. You know the exact figures that are there. You can't just say, well, let's score up quarks as having a 3 and down quarks as having a 9 in terms of Gimel things. These things are exactly as they should be. Yeah. And when you start calculating it, everything comes together. And suddenly we have things which might link up. But of course, there's a question.
Well, let me try and rephrase what you've just said. I think what I'm hearing you say is the calculations that you have developed using pure mathematics for the ratios between the proton and the neutron and so on, having to do with the volumetric calculations that incorporate Gimel, have been confirmed by measurements made in the Large Hadron Collider.
Exactly that.
And furthermore, if I understand you more, the idea of the volumetric calculations that you've made also give you some insights as to which particles and which atoms are going to be more permanent or more stable.
Exactly that. Mm-hmm. Because the basis of our existing universe is stability. If something becomes unstable and decays, for example, in microseconds, we don't have a very, very stable universe. Mm-hmm. And the basis of that stability is Gimel. Mm-hmm. And you can apply this at every level, not only at the level of quantum physics. And there's a beauty about this, which we might get into. You're going to apply this at the level of our macro reality and even at the levels of cosmology. Mm-hmm. In other words, we have one fundamental law, and that is the laws of nature. And everything can be unified under that one single laws of nature. And you might say, but what about a deity? That would be part of the laws of nature. Maybe a divinity would be the nature component. But the important point about it is the missing substance, the missing component has been Gimel.
Now, and you're suggesting that Gimel itself is required for stability in the physical universe. Otherwise, everything would be decaying so rapidly as to provide no continuity.
Exactly that.
And if we take another leap and suggest, as you do suggest, that Gimel is equivalent to consciousness, one might say that consciousness in the large sense is what is holding our universe together.
Wonderful assumption. Now let me throw in one more component. The component here is we have our physical world that we experience.
Yes.
It's a restricted world containing, or that is extending in 3 dimensions of space, but literally a physical space. Remember that extension of space is far, far beyond just what we're talking about in terms of length, breadth, and height at that physical level in one tiny moment in time. And I sometimes talk about the 3 dimensions of time, and people always say, oh, you mean past, present, future? That's one dimension. Yeah. That's just one unitary thing. We are dealing with volumetric phenomena. For that stability, you need an extra union. And that extra union is that Gimel. It might be consciousness, which is why we might not realize it, because we were talking about our experience is this restricted 3 dimensions of space. Yeah. It's restricted. We can't experience, for example, X-rays, and yet it's in the 3 dimensions of space, the ultraviolet, the infrared spectrum. So we're restricted in that moment in time, and we think that's our experience, but there's the other component, and that is our existence. And always we are dealing with existence, except most of that existence is covert. And a lot of that existence in that hierarchy, the space possibly being contained or embedded within the time, and the time being embedded within that union that we call consciousness, experience and existence. It's really finite existence, and beyond that we can go to the infinite. But this is the key component, because part of this finite existence of consciousness we wouldn't even know about most of the time Because it's above what we are experiencing. Well, and a lot of what we call psi phenomena are at that level. A lot of it is immediate. It doesn't require even travel at the speed of light, for example.
Well, the word consciousness has many different meanings.
Yeah.
We're talking about individual consciousness. We may be talking about consciousness of God, or as you've suggested, psychic awareness.
Exactly
as
that.
well. And so if we assume that Gimel represents consciousness, which is I think a good working hypothesis, then it would seem to me as if we've got to account for various levels or types of Gimel.
Exactly that. Now let me just give you a couple of examples, because discussing consciousness would be a very detailed, separate kind of discussion.
Yeah.
But let me just mention this, that at the fundamental level, we have the hydrogen atom.
Yes.
And hydrogen is, as you know, and as our audience knows as well, the most ubiquitous of all the elements. It constitutes almost everything in terms of cosmology and in terms of our existence.
And it's the simplest of all molecules.
And yet it's the most complex as well, because of the fact that hydrogen has a proton, an electron, but the stable hydrogen, hydrogen 1, protium, does not have a neutron. And yet when you do your calculations, it has to have something, otherwise it would be totally unstable.
Right.
So we think that instead of that neutron, it contains an enormous amount more Gimel. Except, of course, we're going to have the cynics saying, well, how do you know that Gimel is the same Gimel as you're referring to in those other calculations? We don't. We can assume it.
Yeah.
But because of it, we sometimes call that Dalet, which is the fourth letter of the Hebrew alphabet.
Yes.
But it's the same thing. So let's assume that Gimel incorporates Dalet, which may or may not be the same form of consciousness, because you've said there are many kinds of consciousness there. Now, if one looks at it that way, the first thing, of course, one asks is, well, what else could it be besides consciousness? Well, this is the whole point. This is why we call it Gimel. We can't find a good alternative, and it would be nice and covert. But hydrogen, therefore, as the simplest of the elements, is the most complex, because that's the only one that does not have a neutron. You might say there are isotopes of hydrogen, and some of my audience might know about deuterium, which does have a neutron, and which scores the same amount in terms of scores, in terms of true units, but with far, far less Gimel, because it's compensating for a neutron. And we have other isotopes like tritium. But that's besides the point. But this is why when you start looking at these figures, you say, but when you look at these figures, these just don't say it's 1, it's 1.0002, and you've got these little extras. But be that as it may, we have a beautiful component here of a form of something as opposed to nothing. And that something actually probably might have even preceded all the extra components. This is why we called our book Reality Begins with Consciousness.
So what you're saying, to paraphrase once again, Vernon, is that hydrogen, simple hydrogen, the most common element in the entire known universe, if I get you correctly, has more Gimel than any other element.
By far. And then we have a whole hierarchy of what we call the life elements. And you would hypothesize that the life elements would have more Gimel than the other elements. Now, I love mnemonics. And so I will give you a simple way to remember the life elements. The word chosen. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur, leave out the E, that's just an extra, and nitrogen. So those are the fundamental life elements. Throw in calcium and magnesium, and these are the ones that you can calculate out, have the same amount of Gimel except for the hydrogen, which is far higher. but have the most Gimel of all these elements. There are 2 or 3 other elements that also have that. There are 2 noble gases, helium and neon, and we have hypothesized, this is a testable hypothesis, that silicon is a life element. It has some of the same properties of carbon, incidentally, but it also fits the same structure. And when you do the mathematical calculations, let's just say that they are all cubic multiples of 108 cubed. And so this is the component there. We're not just talking mathematics here, we're talking logic. And when you start going further, you discover that the most ubiquitous chemical that we need, that is fundamental in terms of life, is water. And water has that same 10 cubed times 108 cubed component. It is linked up there.
So for people who are into numerology, what you're saying is the number 108 is essential to all of life.
In a way, yes, because this is the common element in terms of those different equations we spoke about. You get to 108 cubed by calculating out exactly allocating different amounts of Gimel. Now, here's something interesting about Gimel as well. When you start doing these calculations, I mentioned electrons as elementary particles and up quarks and down quarks. You'd think that up and down quarks, at each up quark would contain the same amount of Gimel. It doesn't. They are different for the amount of Gimel in the first up quark, the second up quark in protons, and the down quark. And then you go to the electrons. It actually works out at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's a very interesting component if you're dealing with numerology.
So you're able to get some very precise mathematical indications about the degree to which Gimel is present in each different subatomic elementary particle.
Exactly. But there's one more component here as well. If these are different, and if we're thinking we're making this a big conceptual jump to consciousness, we would think there would be different kinds of consciousness in each one, in union with each one of these up and down quarks and with the electrons, which is very interesting. You would also be able to make a conceptual jump for those who say, well, we're dealing with multiverses. This is just one of our universes. We have all the same thing. You know what's amazing mathematically? All these multiverses, all these universes, if they existed, would still contain that same quantity of Gimel, and would all still be made up of the up quarks and the down quarks and the electrons, all fitting into the protons, neutrons, and electrons, all making up the atom.
Well, now we're getting into some very advanced kinds of thought when you're talking about multiverses and what might be the physical properties of other multiverses. Let me ask you a question to kind of bring it back to here and now, because you've mentioned silicon as a potential element having to do with life. Would your theory predict that we can build conscious robots? Silicon-based life forms.
You said, now we're getting back to things, and then you ask me about conscious robots. We're miles out. I'm not sure. But the point about it is, understand one thing. With our robots, if we're just talking about mass and energy, and if we're just talking about space and time, I think we're in trouble.
With no consciousness.
If we are incorporating in that union, which is a necessary union, just think of it as no longer are you talking about space and time. You're talking about space, time, and Gimel.
Yes.
And no longer are you talking about mass and energy. You're talking about mass and energy and Gimel content. If you were able to incorporate all of those together, you would effectively maybe have a robot that would work with consciousness, but maybe in order to do this, you might have to argue that this would be the function of a divinity. One could throw around all sorts of philosophical components, but let me just summarize where we are here. We're dealing with something, Gimel, which is ubiquitous. It is not only, we think, in this finite reality of a 9-dimensional existence. It might even derive from the infinite, and it might be the component that orders things. We will not recognize that there is Gimel if we just look at our small amount of 3 dimensions of space and a moment in time. So we had Kaluza and separately Klein coming along and saying, well, maybe there's a 5th dimension. The problem that they had, and incidentally, Einstein worked for 20 years on extra dimensions. The problem that they had was, again, they should have been dealing with volumes as opposed to single elements. But the most important component is they did not introduce consciousness into this whole equation of physics. And this is one of the titles of a paper we wrote. You'll find all sorts of things under groundbreaking paradigm shifts. In my website, you mentioned the Pacific Neuropsychiatric Institute, pni.org. You'll find it all there, some of the complexities in terms of this calculation. But the important thing is to introduce stability into our world, to introduce symmetry, and the most symmetric of these elements, and also we mentioned a compound called water, is linked up with the most Gimel. You mentioned the mathematics, and this is something that's important, that Gimel is a union and a unifying concept.
Gimel has other uses as well. You've mentioned the possibility that we can understand the function of catalysts better.
Yes, that is true. And we won't talk about uses. Just remember, we're talking about something that is in union with every single particle in existence. And there has been a mystery in medicine and in biology for many years. And that is, there are a group of chemicals, very often elemental chemicals, maybe some copper or some iron or a few other of these that go through pathways, and they come out unchanged at the other end. But the problem is they speed up these pathways enormously. And this is what our life is all about, because we can speed up by orders of magnitude if we have the right catalysts. And it occurred to us a couple of months ago, very recently, that wait a minute, Gimel is in union with everything, and yet it comes out unchanged, that it's this whole component. Could it be that some of these catalysts are actually Gimel? And it might be linked up with consciousness. Gimel has content, mass, energy, Gimel. It has extent, space, time, Gimel. And these are different summary elements in terms of the stability. We don't recognize most of it because it's covert. We're talking existence as opposed to experience. And we're talking about a major, major paradigm shift. Now let me introduce to you one more thing. Here's the one more thing. Gimel is dynamic. Gimel is not just something that's static. We spoke about gluons, which is the glue for the neutrons and the protons. This is dynamic. It is spinning. It is rotating. Imagine a ballerina rotating, big, big dress. And right at the edge of that dress, the extreme, the circumference of that whole rotational component, the horizon, rotating with something, again, a complex physical thing with angular momentum.
If I understand your theory, through 9 dimensions.
Through 9 dimensions, exactly. And it won't work out beyond that. So you remember in physics, we always talk about spin. And they talk about half spin, and maybe you have 1/2 spin or 2/3 spin or this or that or the other. It's meaningless. If you start rotating from axis number 1, which is that first dimension, through 9 dimensions, you have 8 rotations there. 8 360-degree rotations. You have 4 whole rotations in terms of this. You don't need to come along and say, well, we don't understand it, it's just weird. We'll use this idea of spin. We know everything is rotating. It's the Gimel that's rotating. And this is part of our latest model. We don't yet have the mathematics fully worked out. But there is the way that space and time are incorporating into consciousness at the extremes. This is where mass and energy are linked up. And it's more than a linkage. Don't think of this as just this bridge or this component of, well, we have a separate universe. This is all a union. And it's all rotating.
And I gather that
beautifully.
This model will enable you to resolve some of the apparent paradoxes that we see in quantum physics as it's conventionally taught.
Yes, conventionally very much so. So, for example, we have this whole dilemma with dark matter and dark energy. And we've published on this, and perhaps we can talk a little about that in another discussion. But dark matter and dark energy are intimately linked with Gimel. Infinity is intimately linked with Gimel. Order in our reality is infinitely linked with Gimel. And maybe the whole concept, and this is controversial because here we're throwing in consciousness and debates here, but the whole concept even of these psi phenomena and also of even survival is linked up. Because
when you say survival, you're talking about post-mortem survival.
And ante-mortem and beforehand, if you want. All of these, you see, the point about it is in conventional physics, with just space, time, mass, and energy, we talk about entropy. We talk about this ultimate tendency towards disorder. Well, put it this way. I have a lot of order and you have a lot of order. And my audience has a lot of order as well. When we look at this whole concept of what we're calling ordropy, which is this order which probably comes from the infinite and probably involves its own conservation. It's a conservation of Gimel in a way.
Well, I want to make one final point because you've hinted at it several times, but it's as if Gimel is sort of a link between the realm of infinity and the realm, the finite realm in which we find ourselves.
We think so.
Dr. Vernon Neppe, once again, I would have to say this discussion is nothing short of mind-blowing. Thank you so much for sharing your insights.
It's my pleasure again, Jeff, and thank you, too, to this audience.
Yes, and thank you, too, for being with us.